The voyage they never expected me to take. Sometimes the best family vacation is the one you take without the family. Share this if you have ever been told you had slow everyone down. They thought I couldn't hear them through the thin kitchen wall, but at 68, my hearing is still sharp enough to catch a whispered conversation that cuts right through my heart. My daughter, in-law Sandra, was chopping vegetables for the children's lunch, while my son Michael leaned against the counter, both of them speaking in those careful, hushed tones people use when they are discussing someone they assume is too old to matter. "We really cannot bring her on the Mediterranean cruise," Sandra said, her voice carrying that practiced patience she used when explaining why certain things were impossible. "You know how she gets with all the walking. Those European ports require so much stamina, and honestly, having to worry about whether she can keep up will just stress everyone out." I stood frozen in the hallway, a basket of clean laundry from their guest room balanced against my hip, listening to my own son make a soft sound of agreement. Plus the excursions we want to do. The hiking in Santorini, the bike tours through Rome. It is just not realistic with her mobility issues. My mobility issues, I had arthritis in my knees and used a walking stick on bad days, but I had been walking 3 miles every morning for the past 10 years. I had hiked parts of the Appalachian Trail when I was 62, but apparently, in their minds, I would become someone who needed to be managed rather than included. "Maybe we can plan something special for her while we are gone," Sandra continued. And I could hear the false brightness creeping into her voice. A nice spa day or something local. She would probably enjoy that more. Anyway, I had already paid my deposit for the cruise 3 weeks earlier when they had first mentioned the family trip. $5,000 transferred from my savings account to reserve a spot in what they had called the adventure of a lifetime. Michael had seemed genuinely excited when he had called to tell me about it. "Mom, we are booking this incredible Mediterranean cruise for the whole family," he had said, his voice warm with enthusiasm. "Barcelona to Rome, with stops in Monaco, Florence, Naples. The kids are old enough now to really appreciate the history and culture. We want you there to share it with us." I had been so touched by the invitation, so grateful to be included in something that wasn't a doctor's appointment or a carefully timed visit when they needed babysitting. This felt like recognition that I was still part of their lives in a meaningful way, not just a convenience to be utilized when needed. "Are you sure there is room?" I had asked, because I had learned over the years to double-check my welcome rather than assume it. "Of course there is room, Mom. You are family. It wouldn't be the same without you there to see Emma and Jake experience Europe for the first time." So I had booked my cabin immediately, choosing a balcony stateroom on the same deck as their family suite. I had even offered to help with expenses for the children's activities, wanting to contribute to what I genuinely believed would be a bonding experience for all of us. Now, standing in their hallway with a basket of their freshly folded towels, I understood the truth. They would let me book because it was easier than saying no directly, but they had never intended for me to actually be part of the experience. I was meant to be the extra person they tolerated if they had to, the obligation they would fulfill if pressed, but not someone they actually wanted sharing their adventure. I spent the rest of that afternoon going through the motions of helpful grandmother behavior. I finished their laundry, helped Emma with her Spanish vocabulary homework, watched Jake practice his soccer skills in the backyard. I smiled and nodded when Sandra mentioned restaurant reservations they had made in Barcelona and asked if I thought I could handle all that walking. But underneath my pleasant demeanor, something was shifting. A kind of clarity I hadn't felt in years was emerging from the hurt and disappointment. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat at my own kitchen table back home with a cup of chamomile tea and the cruise paperwork spread out in front of me. My cabin reservation was confirmed, paid in full, with my name clearly printed on all the documentation. Eleanor Williams, cabin 8247, Ocean View balcony. I stared at it for a long time, then reached for my phone and dialed the cruise line's customer service number. "Celestial Seas. This is Amanda speaking. How can I help you tonight? Hello. I have a reservation for your Mediterranean voyage next month, and I would like to make some changes. Of course, Mrs. Williams. Let me pull up your booking. I see you are currently in a balcony stateroom on deck 8. What kind of changes were you thinking about? I took a breath, feeling something bold and unfamiliar stirring in my chest. I would like to upgrade to your most luxurious suite, the one with the most privacy and the best amenities. There was a pause. Well, we do have the Admiral's suite available on deck 12. It includes a private butler, priority dining reservations, a marble bathroom with a soaking tub, and a wraparound terrace that is larger than most people's living rooms, but it is significantly more expensive than your current booking. How much more expensive? She quoted a figure that made me swallow hard. It was more money than I had spent on myself in years, possibly decades. Money I had been saving for emergencies or for helping the family with unexpected expenses. I will take it, I said, before I could change my mind. Are you certain? It is quite a substantial increase. I am 68 years old, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. I have been pinching pennies and putting everyone else's comfort before my own for my entire adult life. Yes, I am certain. She processed the upgrade with professional efficiency, reading back the confirmation details for a suite that sounded like something from a luxury hotel rather than a ship cabin. Private dining service, personal concierge, premium shore excursion access, priority boarding. When I hung up the phone, I sat in the quiet of my kitchen for a long time, my hands wrapped around the warm mug. For the first time in recent memory, I had made a decision purely for myself, not to help someone else, not to be useful or convenient or accommodating, just because I wanted something and decided I deserved to have it. I didn't tell Michael and Sandra about the upgrade. Over the next few weeks, I let them continue believing I would be squeezed into economy accommodations while they enjoyed their family bonding experience. They sent me a few texts about meeting times and suggested restaurants, always with that subtle undertone of doubt about whether I could handle the itinerary they had planned. Mom, just so you know, we will probably be doing a lot of walking tours. Michael mentioned during one of our phone calls, don't feel like you have to keep up with everything. You can always find a nice cafe and wait while we explore. Of course, I replied pleasantly. I will manage just fine. 3 days before departure, Sandra sent me a group text that included their nanny, Michael's sister Karen, and Karen's teenage daughters. So excited for our family adventure. Weather looks perfect. Eleanor, make sure you pack comfortable walking shoes and don't overpack. Remember, you will have to manage your own luggage most of the time. I didn't respond to the text. Instead, I spent that afternoon shopping for clothes I had never imagined wearing on a family trip. A silk dress in deep sapphire blue, linen pants in cream and navy, a cashmere wrap that felt like luxury against my skin, leather sandals that were both elegant and comfortable. I also visited my hairdresser for the first time in months, getting a cut and style that made me look less like someone's obligation, and more like someone who belonged in beautiful places. The morning of departure was crisp and bright, with that particular kind of autumn sunshine that makes everything look newly polished. I wore a traveling outfit I had chosen specifically for first impressions. Navy blazer, white silk blouse, well-tailored slacks, and a scarf that brought out the blue in my eyes. At the port, I bypassed the general boarding lines and walked directly to the suite guest priority check. The agent behind the counter smiled warmly when she saw my name on the manifest. Admiral's Suite, Mrs. Williams. Welcome aboard the Celestial Horizon. Your butler, James, will meet you at your suite to help you settle in. The title felt strange and wonderful on my ears. Not Mom, or Grandma Eleanor, or Mrs. Williams. We need to discuss your grandson's behavior. Just Mrs. Williams, sweet guest, valued passenger. I walked up the gangway with my head high, pulling my single elegant suitcase behind me. By the time Michael's family arrived for general boarding 3 hours later, I was already settled into my suite with a glass of champagne on my private terrace, watching other passengers stream aboard from what felt like a completely different world. The Admiral's suite was beyond anything I could have imagined. 1,200 square feet of pure luxury, with floor-to-ceiling windows that opened onto a terrace large enough to host a dinner party. The bedroom had a king-sized bed with Egyptian cotton sheets and down pillows that felt like clouds. The bathroom featured a marble soaking tub, a separate rain shower, and toiletries that smelled like expensive perfume. But more than the physical luxury, it was the service that astounded me. James, my butler, was a distinguished man from Jamaica who treated me with a level of attention and respect I hadn't experienced in years. Mrs. Williams, I have taken the liberty of making dinner reservations at Lumi Ri, our premier restaurant. For this evening, however, if you prefer to dine privately on your terrace, I can arrange for the chef to prepare something special, just for you. The terrace sounds lovely, I said, still adjusting to the idea that my preferences mattered enough to be consulted. Excellent choice, and for tomorrow's port day in Barcelona, I have arranged for a private guide who specializes in architecture and art history. She will meet you at the gangway and can customize the tour based on your interests. I almost told him that I would be meeting up with my family, but stopped myself. Why should I? They had made it clear that I would be slowing them down. Let them manage their own plans while I enjoyed the kind of day I had always dreamed of having in one of the world's most beautiful cities. That first evening, I dined alone on my terrace as the ship pulled away from the harbor. The sunset painted the Mediterranean in shades of gold and rose, while I enjoyed perfectly prepared sea bass and a glass of wine that cost more than I usually spent on groceries in a week. For the first time in decades, no one was asking me to help with anything. No one needed me to find lost toys or mediate sibling arguments or clean up spilled drinks. I was simply Eleanor, a woman having dinner on a beautiful evening, with no obligations beyond enjoying herself. Around 9 of the clock, as I was finishing a dessert that was too beautiful to eat quickly, I heard familiar voices from somewhere below. Through the railings of my terrace, I could see the public pool deck, where families were gathered for evening activities. I spotted them immediately, Michael pushing Jake on a swing set up near the kids' club, Sandra organizing Emma's backpack for tomorrow's excursion, Karen trying to manage her own teenage daughters who clearly wanted to be anywhere else. They looked frazzled in the way that large family groups always do on the first day of vacation. Sunburned, despite the evening hour, laden with bags and water bottles, and the accumulated detritus of traveling with children. Sandra kept checking her phone and pointing at various areas of the ship, clearly trying to coordinate logistics for the next day. I watched them for a few minutes, feeling an odd mixture of recognition and detachment. That had been my role for so many years. The organizer, the helper, the one who sacrificed her own experience to make sure everyone else was comfortable. From my elevated position in my private suite, literally and figuratively above their chaos, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Not vindictive satisfaction, but genuine relief that I wasn't down there managing other people's stress and trying to make myself small enough to fit into their plans. I finished my wine slowly, then went inside to the marble bathroom for a long soak in the tub. The water was perfectly hot, scented with lavender salts that James had thoughtfully provided. I lay there until my fingers wrinkled, reading a novel I would brought for pleasure rather than to pass time while waiting for someone else to need me. When I finally went to bed in the enormous suite bedroom, with its silky sheets and perfect temperature control, I slept more deeply than I had in months. The next morning dawned bright and clear as we approached Barcelona. I woke naturally, without an alarm, to the sound of seagulls and the gentle motion of the ship docking. Room service arrived exactly when James had promised, with fresh coffee, warm croissants, and fruit that looked like it belonged in a still life painting. I took my breakfast on the terrace, watching the port come alive with activity below. Vendors setting up stalls, tour buses queuing for passengers, local guides holding signs for various excursion groups. At precisely 9 of the clock, as James had arranged, a woman named Isabella appeared at my suite door. She was perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of elegant bearing that suggested she had spent her life among beautiful things. Mrs. Williams, I am Isabella Martinez, your private guide for Barcelona. I understand you are interested in architecture and perhaps some art museums? I am, I said, feeling a flutter of excitement I hadn't experienced in years. I have always wanted to see God's work in person. Wonderful. I have arranged for us to visit the Sagrada Familia first, when the light is best, then we will explore the Gothic Quarter and perhaps end at the Picasso Museum if you are not too tired. Too tired, the phrase that had been hanging over my head for weeks, the assumption that I couldn't handle a full day of exploration. But Isabella said it without condescension, simply checking my preferences like any good guide would with any valued client. I would love to see everything, I said. Barcelona exceeded every expectation I had ever had. Isabella was not just knowledgeable but passionate, sharing stories about the city's history and art that brought every building and sculpture to life. We spent 2 hours at the Sagrada Familia, where she helped me understand the symbolism in God's incredible façades and the way light played through the forest. Like columns inside, in the Gothic Quarter, we wandered through narrow medieval streets while she pointed out architectural details I never would have noticed on my own. We stopped at a small CF where she ordered us local specialties, and we talked about art and travel and the particular joy of discovering beauty in unexpected places. You have a good eye, she told me, as we stood before a particular stunning example of Catalan Gothic architecture. Many tourists rush through without really seeing. You take time to appreciate. It was the first time in years that someone had complimented me on something other than my usefulness to other people. Not thank you for watching the children, or you are so helpful with the groceries, but recognition of my own capacity for appreciation and understanding. We finished the day at the Picasso Museum, where I stood before paintings I had only seen in books and felt tears in my eyes, not from sadness, but from the pure joy of being exactly where I wanted to be, experiencing exactly what I had chosen to experience. When I returned to the ship that evening, I was tired, but exhilarated. My feet hurt from walking on ancient cobblestones. My head was spinning with everything I had learned, and my heart felt fuller than it had in years. James greeted me at the suite door with a warm smile and immediately drew me a bath, adding oils that would soothe my aching muscles. He had arranged for dinner to be served on the terrace again, this time featuring local Spanish cuisine inspired by the day's port visit. As I soaked in the marble tub, I could hear the sounds of general boarding through the ship's walls, families returning from their group tours, children complaining about tired feet and missed lunch, parents negotiating bedtimes and screen time and the logistics of tomorrow's schedule. I felt a moment of curiosity about how Michael's family had managed their day, but it passed quickly. Whatever they had experienced, however they had handled the challenges of group travel with children, it was their story to live. I had my own story now, and it was turning out to be more beautiful than I had ever imagined possible. That night, I stood on my terrace in a silk robe, watching the lights of Barcelona fade as we sailed toward our next destination. Tomorrow would be Monaco. Another day of possibilities, another opportunity to choose exactly how I wanted to spend my time and energy. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't responsible for anyone's happiness, but my own. And I was discovering that my own happiness was far more interesting and sustainable than I had ever given it credit for. The second day brought Monaco, that tiny principality that seems designed specifically for people who have decided they deserve beautiful things. I woke to find the ship anchored in azure water, so clear I could see the sandy bottom through my terrace railings. James appeared with breakfast and a gentle suggestion. Mrs. Williams, I have arranged for a helicopter transfer to Monaco, if you are interested. It is a 12-minute flight, with spectacular views of the coastline. Otherwise, there is a tender boat that takes about 30 minutes, a helicopter. I had never been in one, had never even considered it as a possibility for someone like me. But here was James, presenting it as simply another option, as if expensive helicopter rides were a normal part of any reasonable person's travel experience. The helicopter sounds wonderful, I heard myself saying. 20 minutes later, I was lifting off from the ship's helipad, wearing a headset, and watching the Mediterranean spread out below me like a jeweled tapestry. The pilot pointed out landmarks as we flew: the famous casino, the Prince's Palace, the harbor full of yachts that cost more than most people's houses. I felt like I was living someone else's life, but in the best possible way, not because I was pretending to be someone I wasn't, but because I was finally allowing myself to be someone I had always been but had never had permission to explore. In Monaco, I wandered through the exotic gardens, toured the Prince's Palace, and spent an hour in a café overlooking the harbor, drinking champagne and eating olives, while watching impossibly beautiful people walk by in clothes that cost more than my monthly Social Security check. I thought about Michael and Sandra, probably managing group transportation to some family-friendly attraction, negotiating with tired children, and checking their phones constantly to make sure they were staying on schedule. The thought didn't make me feel superior or vindictive, just grateful that I was no longer obligated to sacrifice my own peace for the chaos that seems to follow families everywhere. Around midday, I spotted them. Pure coincidence. I was walking along the harbor front when I heard Jake's distinctive laugh echoing from a crowded restaurant terrace. Through the chaos of families dining al fresco, I could see Michael wiping something off Emma's shirt, while Sandra gestured animatedly at a waiter who clearly didn't speak much English. Karen's teenage daughters sat slumped in their chairs, staring at their phones with the particular brand of misery that comes from being forced to spend time with younger cousins when you would rather be anywhere else. Jake was bouncing in his seat, probably overstimulated from too much sugar and too many new experiences. I paused for a moment, watching this tableau of family vacation stress. 6 months ago, I would have felt obligated to join them, to help manage the chaos, to make myself useful by taking some of the burden off the overwhelmed adults. Now, I simply adjusted my elegant sun hat and continued walking. They had chosen their experience, and I had chosen mine. Neither was wrong, but only one of them was serving my needs and honoring my preferences. I spent the afternoon in the Monte Carlo casino, not gambling. I have never seen the point of giving away money I worked hard to earn, but marveling at the incredible architecture and people watching. The casino was like a museum of human behavior, full of tourists trying to capture the glamour they had seen in movies and high rollers who treated massive bets like most people treat lunch money. I ordered a mineral water with lime and sat in a corner where I could observe everything without being observed. An elderly woman in spectacular jewelry sat alone at a slot machine, methodically feeding it coins while sipping champagne. A young couple argued quietly over a roulette table, their vacation clearly not going as planned. A group of men in expensive suits laughed too loudly at jokes that probably weren't funny, performing wealth and confidence for anyone watching. What struck me most was how many people seemed to be performing rather than simply being, playing roles they thought the environment required instead of simply enjoying themselves authentically. I left the casino feeling more grateful than ever for the choice I had made. No performance required, no one to impress or accommodate. Just me, having exactly the experience I wanted to have. The helicopter ride back to the ship was even more spectacular than the morning flight. The setting sun turned the water into liquid gold, and the coast of France looked like something from a dream. When we landed on the ship's helipad, I felt like I was returning home to a place that had been designed specifically for my comfort and pleasure. James greeted me with the news that he had arranged for a private dinner with the ship's executive chef in the specialty restaurant's wine cellar. Chef Laurent wanted to prepare something special for you, he explained. He was inspired by your day in Monaco. The dinner was beyond anything I could have imagined. 7 courses, each paired with a different wine, served in an intimate cellar surrounded by thousands of bottles from around the world. Chef Laurent, a distinguished Frenchman with genuine warmth in his eyes, presented each course personally and explained his inspiration. For someone who appreciates beauty and takes time to savor experiences, he said as he presented the final course, a delicate lavender KRLE that looked too beautiful to eat. I realized that this was what it felt like to be valued for who I was, rather than what I could do for others. Not because I was helpful or accommodating or willing to sacrifice my own preferences, but because I was worth creating beautiful experiences for. As I sipped the final wine of the evening, a dessert wine from the Loire Valley that tasted like liquid sunshine, I thought about all the years I had spent believing that my value lay in my usefulness to others, how I had made myself smaller and smaller, asking for less and less, until I would almost disappeared entirely into the role of convenient grandmother and helpful mother-in-law. But here, in this wine cellar, with this extraordinary meal and this level of attention and care, I remembered something I had forgotten. I was interesting. I was worth spending time with. I had stories to tell, and opinions worth hearing, and a capacity for joy that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs or expectations. When I finally returned to my suite that night, I found a small gift waiting on my pillow, a book about Mediterranean architecture that Isabella had mentioned during our tour of Barcelona, along with a note from James saying he had noticed my interest and thought I might enjoy reading about the places we would be visiting in the coming days. I sat on my terrace with the book and a cup of chamomile tea, reading about the historical influences that had shaped the cities we would be exploring. For the first time in decades, I was learning something purely for my own enjoyment, not to help a grandchild with homework, or to make conversation at a family dinner. Tomorrow would bring Florence, and after that, Rome. Cities I had dreamed of visiting my entire life, but had never imagined I would experience as anything other than a tag. A long family member, grateful for whatever scraps of beauty I could appreciate between managing other people's needs. Now I had Isabella arranged to meet me in each port, James coordinating every detail of my comfort, and Chef Laurent planning special meals inspired by our destinations. I had an itinerary designed around my interests and a level of service that treated me like someone whose happiness mattered. As I prepared for sleep in my enormous suite bedroom, with its perfect linens and total privacy, I realized something that should have been obvious, but had taken me 6 decades to understand. I didn't have to earn the right to enjoy beautiful things. I didn't have to justify my worth through usefulness to others. I could simply decide that I deserved wonderful experiences and then create them for myself. It was a revelation that would change everything. Florence arrived with morning mist rising from the Arno River and church bells echoing across terracotta rooftops. From my terrace, I could see the city awakening, vendors setting up in the markets, tourists gathering in confused clusters near tour buses, locals hurrying to work with the efficient grace of people who lived among world treasures without needing to photograph them. Isabella met me at the gangway with her characteristic warmth, and that day's plan, the Uffizi Gallery in the morning, when crowds were lighter, lunch at a small osteria that tourists never found, then an afternoon exploring artisan workshops in the Oltrarno district. Today is about understanding how beauty gets made, she told me as we walked through the surprisingly quiet streets toward the gallery. Florence isn't just a museum, it is a living workshop where people have been creating magnificent things for centuries. The Uffizi was overwhelming in the best possible way. Standing before Botticelli's Birth of Venus, I felt tears gathering in my eyes. Not from sentimentality, but from the sheer privilege of being in the presence of something so perfectly conceived and executed. Isabella guided me through the galleries with patience and insight, helping me understand not just what I was seeing, but why these particular works had survived centuries and continued to move people. She talked about the politics and personalities behind the art, the competitive relationships between artists, the way wealthy patrons had shaped what got created and preserved. Art history is really people history, she said as we stood before a Caravaggio that seemed to glow with inner light. These paintings tell us how people lived, what they valued, what they feared and hoped for. We spent 3 hours in the gallery, but it felt like minutes. Isabella had a gift for knowing when to provide information and when to let silence work its magic. She understood that some experiences needed space to settle into memory. Lunch was at a tiny family-run restaurant where the grandmother still made pasta by hand every morning. Isabella ordered for us in rapid Italian, and we were served dishes I had never heard of, but that tasted like someone's most cherished family recipes. My Nana made something similar. The elderly woman who owned the restaurant told me in careful English when she saw me savoring the pappardelle with wild boar ragout. You eat like someone who understands food is love. The afternoon in the artisan workshops was a revelation. We visited a leather craftsman who created handbags and shoes using techniques passed down through generations, a jeweler who specialized in reproducing Renaissance designs, and a bookbinder who worked with tools that looked medieval but produced results that were utterly contemporary. In each workshop, Isabella introduced me not as a tourist to be tolerated, but as someone genuinely interested in understanding their craft. The artisans responded by sharing stories and techniques they usually reserved for serious collectors or fellow craftspeople. The leather worker let me try my hand at tooling a simple design into a piece of scrap leather. The jeweler showed me how different metals responded to heat and pressure. The bookbinder demonstrated the ancient art of marbling paper, creating swirled patterns that looked like captured clouds. "You have good hands," the bookbinder told me as I successfully completed a simple binding technique. "Steady and patient. These are gifts not everyone has." Another compliment that had nothing to do with my usefulness to anyone else. Another recognition of my own capabilities and worth. As we walked back toward the ship in the late afternoon, Isabella asked me something that surprised me. "Are you traveling with family?" I ask because you seem to approach experiences like someone who has been waiting a long time to please only herself. I thought about how to answer. Yes, they are on the ship. But we are. We are having different vacations. She nodded with understanding. Sometimes that is the wisest choice. Family can make us forget who we are when we are not being useful to others. That evening, I dined again on my terrace, this time with dishes inspired by our day in Florence. Handmade pasta with truffle oil, osso buco that fell off the bone, and a brunello that James had selected specifically to complement Chef Laurent's interpretation of Tuscan cuisine. As I ate, I could hear the sounds of family dinners drifting up from the main dining rooms below, children's voices mixing with adult conversations, the clatter of silverware and glasses, the organized chaos of large groups, trying to coordinate dessert orders and tomorrow's plans. I felt no longing to join that chaos. Instead, I felt grateful for the peace and luxury of my chosen solitude. I was experiencing Florence, really experiencing it in a way that wouldn't have been possible if I had been managing other people's schedules and needs and preferences. Around 9 of the clock, as I was finishing my wine and reading more about Renaissance art history, I heard a familiar voice from the deck below. Emma, my granddaughter, was explaining something to her brother in that patient way she had inherited from her mother. "Jake, you cannot just run everywhere. We have to stay with the group, or we will get lost. Remember what happened in Barcelona when you ran ahead and Mom spent an hour looking for you?" Through the railings, I could see them gathered around a table in the casual dining area. Michael looked tired. Sandra was scrolling through photos on her phone, and Karen appeared to be mediating some sort of disagreement between her teenage daughters. Jake was bouncing in his seat despite Emma's attempts to calm him down. Even from my elevated position, I could see the familiar signs of family vacation overload. Too much stimulation, too many decisions, too many personalities trying to coordinate their individual needs into some semblance of group harmony. For a moment, I felt a tug of old familiarity. The grandmother in me wanted to go down there and help manage the chaos, to offer to take Jake for a walk so the adults could have a peaceful dinner, to smooth over whatever tension was making Karen's daughters sulk. But I didn't move. I stayed on my terrace with my book and my wine, honoring the choice I had made to prioritize my own experience for once in my life. They looked like they were handling their own challenges just fine without my intervention, and I was discovering that my absence from their chaos didn't diminish my love for them. It just clarified the difference between love and obligation. Tomorrow would bring Rome, the eternal city, our final port before heading back to Barcelona. Isabella had already arranged for us to visit the Vatican museums early, before the crowds arrived, and then spend the afternoon exploring neighborhood markets and local churches that most tourists never discovered. As I prepared for bed that night, I realized that I was already thinking about future travels I might take. Maybe a river cruise through Germany's Christmas markets, or a small ship expedition to the Greek islands, or perhaps something completely different, a photography workshop in Iceland or a cooking school in Provence. For the first time in decades, I was thinking about the future as something I got to design, rather than something that would be designed around other people's needs and schedules. The shift felt revolutionary. I was learning to be Eleanor Williams, not just someone's mother or grandmother or helpful family member, but Eleanor Williams, a woman with her own interests and preferences and the resources to honor them. It was the most valuable education I had ever received. Rome dawned gray and dramatic, with clouds that promised rain but delivered only atmospheric lighting that made every building look like it belonged in a Renaissance painting. As we sailed up the coast toward Civitavecchia, I stood on my terrace with morning coffee and watched the eternal city reveal itself through the mist. Today would be our last port before the return journey to Barcelona, and I found myself feeling something I hadn't expected. Sadness that this adventure was drawing to a close, not because I wanted to avoid returning to real life, but because I had discovered a version of myself I didn't want to lose. Isabella met me with her usual warmth but also with an apologetic expression. "Eleanor, I have to confess something. When I was booking our Vatican entry, I discovered that your family has the same tour time. We might encounter them." I felt a flutter of something, not quite anxiety, more like anticipation mixed with uncertainty. "That is fine," I said, and was surprised to find that I meant it. "We will handle whatever happens." The Vatican museums in the early morning were magical in a way that no amount of reading or documentary watching could have prepared me for. Isabella guided me through the galleries with her usual expertise. But today, I found myself paying special attention to everything, knowing that this would be our last exploration together. We stood before the Sistine Chapel ceiling while she explained Michelangelo's techniques and the political pressures he had faced while creating it. I craned my neck back until it ached, trying to absorb every detail of the incredible frescoes. He painted much of this lying on his back, Isabella told me quietly, for 4 years. Imagine the dedication, the physical discomfort, the absolute certainty that what he was creating would outlast any temporary pain around us. Other visitors moved through in whispered awe. The guards maintained their vigilant silence, occasionally shushing groups that forgot they were in a sacred space. It was while I was standing there, completely absorbed in contemplating 4 centuries of artistic genius, that I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Mom. Oh my God, Mom, is that you?" I turned slowly. Michael stood about 10 feet away, his mouth slightly open in surprise. Behind him, Sandra held Emma's hand while Jake craned his neck to look at the ceiling. Karen and her daughters were clustered nearby, all of them looking between Michael and me with expressions of confusion. "Hello, Michael," I said calmly. "What are you? How are you here? I thought you were having trouble with the walking tours." Isabella stepped smoothly beside me, her presence lending an air of professional authority to the moment. "Mrs. Williams has been an excellent touring companion," she said warmly. "We have covered quite a bit of ground over the past few days." Michael's eyes moved between Isabella and me, clearly trying to process this unexpected encounter. "You hired a private guide?" "I did," I said simply. Sandra approached hesitantly, her expression a mixture of surprise and something that might have been embarrassment. "Eleanor, we didn't know you were. We thought you might prefer the ship's organized tours," I finished gently. "No, I decided I wanted to see these cities properly." Emma tugged on my hand. "Grandma Eleanor, you look different. You look fancy." I smiled down at her. "Thank you, sweetheart. I feel fancy." "Where are you staying?" Jake asked, with his characteristic directness. We looked for you at breakfast yesterday, but couldn't find you before I could answer. Karen spoke up. Mom, the tour guide is gathering our group. We need to catch up. There was an awkward moment, where everyone seemed to be waiting for someone else to make the next move. Finally, Michael cleared his throat. Would you like to join us for the rest of the tour? We are doing the St. Peter's Basilica after this. I glanced at Isabella, who gave me an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. Actually, I said, Isabella and I have different plans for this afternoon. But thank you for asking different plans, Sandra asked. We are visiting some neighborhood churches and local markets, things that aren't usually on the tourist itineraries. Michael nodded slowly, though he still looked somewhat stunned by this encounter. Well, maybe we will see you back on the ship. Perhaps, I said. We said our goodbyes with the kind of politeness that covers deeper conversations that will need to happen later. Emma hugged me tightly, and Jake gave me a high five that made me smile despite the underlying tension of the moment. As they walked away to rejoin their tour group, I heard Sandra whisper something to Michael that I couldn't quite catch, though her tone suggested she was processing some kind of realization. Isabella waited until they were out of earshot before speaking. They seem surprised to see you enjoying yourself independently. They are, I said. They have gotten used to thinking of me as someone who needs to be managed, rather than someone who has her own preferences and capabilities. And how do you feel about them seeing you like this? I considered the question as we walked toward the Basilica exit. Honestly, I feel like myself, maybe for the first time in years. The afternoon Isabella had planned was perfect for processing the morning's unexpected encounter. We visited 3 small churches that tourists rarely found, each one intimate and peaceful in ways that the grand tourist sites couldn't match. In a tiny chapel near the Pantheon, I lit a candle for my late husband and said a prayer of gratitude for this journey that had reconnected me with parts of myself I had thought were lost. He would have loved seeing you like this, Isabella said quietly, somehow understanding without my having to explain. He would have, I agreed. He always said I was more interesting than I gave myself credit for. We spent the rest of the afternoon in the Campo de' Fiori market, where Isabella introduced me to vendors she had known for years. I bought spices I had never heard of. Artisanal pasta that would remind me of this day when I cooked it at home. And a beautiful scarf that served no practical purpose except making me feel elegant. Will you keep traveling like this? Isabella asked as we sat in a small cafe with perfect espresso and pastries that looked like jewelry. I think I will, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. This trip has taught me something important about what is possible when I stop asking permission to enjoy my life. What will you tell your family? The truth, I said, that I am not the same person who used to accept whatever leftover attention they were willing to give me. That evening, back on the ship, I dressed carefully for dinner, not because I was trying to prove anything, but because I had learned over the past week that I deserved to look and feel beautiful, regardless of who might notice. James had arranged for my final dinner with Chef Laurent to be served in the ship's most exclusive venue, a private dining room I didn't even know existed, with views of the Roman coastline and a menu that represented all the flavors we had encountered during our Mediterranean journey. As we sailed away from Italy toward our final sea day, I stood on my terrace with a glass of champagne and reflected on everything that had changed since I had made that decision to upgrade my accommodations. I hadn't just purchased luxury service and beautiful experiences. I had purchased permission to value myself, to prioritize my own happiness, to stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. Tomorrow would bring one more day at sea, and then we would dock in Barcelona for disembarkation. I would have to decide how to integrate this new version of myself with the life I had returned to, the family relationships that would need recalibrating, the daily routines that might no longer fit who I was becoming. But tonight, I was simply Eleanor Williams, a woman who had spent a week discovering that she was far more interesting, capable, and deserving of beautiful experiences than anyone, including herself, had given her credit for. And that knowledge was something no one could take away from me. The final sea day brought perfect weather and a kind of bittersweet anticipation that I had never experienced before. Usually, the end of a vacation felt like the end of a reprieve, back to responsibilities and routines and other people's schedules. But this felt different. This felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. I woke without an alarm, as had become my habit, and took breakfast on my terrace while watching dolphins play in the ship's wake. James had prepared a simple but perfect meal: fresh fruit, yogurt with honey, and croissants that were still warm from the ship's bakery. "Mrs. Williams," he said as he poured my coffee, "it has been a genuine pleasure serving you this week. You are exactly the kind of guest who makes this job feel meaningful rather than routine." "Thank you, James. You have made this experience more wonderful than I ever imagined possible. If I may say so, you seem like someone who is ready to appreciate wonderful experiences. Some people travel in luxury but never really inhabit it. You inhabited every moment." After breakfast, I decided to explore parts of the ship I hadn't visited yet, not because I needed to see everything, but because I had learned that I enjoyed discovering beautiful spaces and interesting people. I found myself in the ship's library, a quiet sanctuary lined with books in multiple languages and comfortable reading chairs positioned to catch the best natural light. A few passengers were scattered around, reading or playing quiet games of chess. In one corner, I discovered a woman about my age working on what appeared to be a watercolor painting of the seascape visible through the large windows. She looked up when she noticed me approaching. "It is beautiful," I said, admiring her delicate rendering of the morning light on the water. "Thank you. I am not really an artist, but something about being on the water makes me want to try to capture it." "I am Margaret," she said, extending a paint-stained hand. "I have been wondering about you, about me. You are the woman in the Admiral's suite, aren't you? I have seen you around the ship, always elegantly dressed, always seeming so content with your own company. There is something inspiring about it." I sat down in the chair beside her. "I am Eleanor, and yes, I suppose I have been content with my own company. It is a new experience for me." "New how?" "I spent most of my adult life being useful to other people. This is the first time I have traveled purely for my own pleasure." Margaret nodded with understanding. "I know that feeling. After my husband died 3 years ago, everyone kept telling me what I should do, where I should live, how I should spend my time. It took me 2 years to remember that I got to decide those things for myself." We talked for over an hour about the particular challenges of being older women who had spent decades defining themselves through their relationships to others. Margaret was traveling alone too, having decided that she was tired of waiting for her adult children to have time to join her for the trips she wanted to take. "They love me," she said, mixing blues and whites to capture the color of the sea. "But they love the version of me that fits conveniently into their lives. This version, the one who books solo cruises and takes painting classes, makes them uncomfortable, because it forces them to see you as a whole person rather than just their mother." Exactly, and whole people are more complicated to manage than convenient mothers. Around noon, I made my way to the main pool deck, curious about the general atmosphere on this final day. The scene was predictably chaotic. Families trying to squeeze in last-minute pool time, teenagers flirting dramatically by the hot tubs, parents juggling sunscreen and snack distribution, and the logistics of packing wet swimsuits. I spotted Michael's family immediately. They had claimed a cluster of chairs near the kids' splash area, surrounded by the impressive collection of bags, towels, toys, and electronics that seemed to follow them everywhere. Sandra was reading something on her phone while keeping one eye on Jake, who was determined to befriend every child in the pool. Emma sat beside her mother, working on what appeared to be a journal or sketchbook. Karen's daughters had found a group of other teenagers and were engaged in the complex social negotiations that defined their age group. Michael sat slightly apart from the group, not reading or playing with his phone, just watching the ocean pass by, with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. He looked tired, but not just physically tired. emotionally tired, like someone processing thoughts that required more energy than he had expected to need on vacation. I was debating whether to approach them when Jake spotted me. His face lit up with genuine joy, and he scrambled out of the pool to run toward me, dripping and enthusiastic. "Grandma Eleanor, are you going swimming?" "The water's really warm." His excitement drew the attention of the rest of the family. Emma looked up from her journal and waved. Sandra smiled, though it seemed somewhat strained. Michael stood up and walked over. "Mom." "Hi. We were wondering if we would see you today." "Here I am," I said simply. "Jake's been talking about you all morning," Emma said, joining us. "He told everyone at breakfast that his grandma was on a secret mission to see Europe properly." I laughed. Not secret, exactly, just independent. Michael looked like he wanted to say something, but wasn't sure how to begin. Finally, he asked, "Would you like to sit with us? We have extra chairs." I glanced over at their setup. The organized chaos of family vacation logistics, the constant need to mediate and negotiate and manage multiple personalities and preferences. Then I looked at the quiet corner of the adult pool area, where Margaret was probably still painting, and where I could continue reading my book in peaceful solitude. "Actually," I said, "I was planning to spend some time in the adult area. But thank you for asking." "The adult area?" Sandra asked. "Yes, it is much quieter, better for reading and thinking." There was a moment of silence that felt loaded with unspoken questions and realizations. Then Jake, with the wonderful directness of children, asked, "Are you still our grandma even if you don't want to sit with us?" My heart clenched. "Oh, sweetheart, of course I am still your grandma. I love you just as much as I always have. But grandmas are also individual people with their own preferences, and sometimes I prefer quiet spaces. Like how Emma likes to read alone sometimes," he asked. "Exactly like that." Michael cleared his throat. "Mom, could we talk sometime before we disembark tomorrow? Just you and me?" I looked at him. This son I had raised who was clearly struggling to understand something about our relationship that he had never had to examine before. "Of course," I said. "Why don't you come to my suite around 4 o'clock? We can have coffee and talk properly." "Your suite?" "Yes, Admiral's suite. Deck 12, just ask any crew member for directions." The expression on his face told me he was beginning to understand the extent of the changes I had made, not just to my accommodations, but to my entire approach to this vacation. I spent the rest of the afternoon by the adult pool, reading and occasionally chatting with other passengers who, like me, had discovered the pleasure of travel without constant negotiation and compromise. The atmosphere was relaxed in a way that the family areas could never be. People reading books, having quiet conversations, taking naps in the sun without worrying about anyone else's schedule or needs. At precisely 4 o'clock, there was a knock at my suite door. Michael stood in the hallway looking somewhat overwhelmed, clearly taking in the luxury of my accommodations for the first time. "Mom, this is incredible. Come in," I said, stepping aside. James left coffee and pastries for us on the terrace. He followed me through the suite, his eyes taking in details. The marble bathroom visible through the open bedroom door, the sitting area with its elegant furniture and fresh flowers, the enormous windows that framed the endless blue of the Mediterranean. On the terrace, he sat down heavily in one of the comfortable chairs and accepted the coffee I poured for him. For several minutes we sat in silence, both of us looking out at the ocean. Finally, he spoke. "I don't understand what happened. How did you afford all this?" "I have been saving money for years," I said. "I just never spent it on myself before." "But why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you say you were upgrading your room?" I considered how to answer honestly without being cruel, because you had already decided I would slow you down. You had already determined that this vacation would be easier without me fully participating. I decided to participate anyway, but on my own terms. He winced. "Mom, that is not. We didn't mean, Michael," I said gently. I heard you in your kitchen, 3 weeks ago. You and Sandra discussing how my mobility issues would complicate your plans." His face flushed. "You weren't supposed to hear that." "No, I wasn't. But I did. And it clarified something important for me, which was that I had a choice. I could either accept being seen as a burden to be managed, or I could create my own experience. I chose the latter." He was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee. When he finally looked up, his eyes were pained. "We love you, Mom. You know that, right?" "I do know that, but love and respect aren't the same thing. Love and inclusion aren't the same thing. For too long, I accepted love that came with conditions and limitations." "What kind of conditions?" "The condition that I be grateful for whatever attention you had time to give me. The condition that I not expect to be consulted about plans that affected me. The condition that I prioritize your comfort over my own preferences." He leaned forward. "I never meant to make you feel like that. I know you didn't, but intentions and impact aren't the same thing either." We sat with that for a while. The ship moved steadily through the calm water, and the late afternoon sun painted everything in warm, forgiving light. "So what happens now?" he asked. "When we get home?" "That depends on what you want to happen, and what you are willing to change." "What do you mean?" "I mean that I am not going back to being the person who says yes to everything and asks for nothing. I am not going back to being grateful for leftovers of other people's time and attention. If you want a relationship with me, it needs to be a real relationship. One where my preferences and needs matter as much as everyone else's." "Of course they matter. Do they? When was the last time you asked what I wanted to do for my birthday, instead of just assuming I would be happy with whatever you planned? When was the last time you called me just to see how I was? Not because you needed something." He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. The silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable, but necessary. "I don't know." He finally admitted, "Neither do I, but I would like us to figure it out." "How?" "By starting over. By you getting to know the Eleanor who just spent a week discovering that she is far more interesting and capable than anyone gave her credit for. Including herself." He smiled for the first time since he had arrived. "The Eleanor who books helicopter rides and private tours and luxury suites. The Eleanor who knows she deserves beautiful experiences and is willing to create them for herself." "I would like to get to know her," he said. "Good. Because she is not going anywhere." We talked for another hour, not solving everything, but beginning the conversation that would reshape our relationship going forward. He told me about the stress of trying to manage everyone's vacation expectations, how exhausted he and Sandra had become trying to keep the children entertained and the extended family happy. I told him about Isabella and the private tours, about Margaret and her watercolors, about the daily joy of waking up with no obligations, except to please myself. When he left, he hugged me with more attention and affection than he had shown in years. "Mom," he said as he was leaving, "I am proud of you. For all of this, for choosing yourself." "Thank you," I said. "That means more than you know." That evening, I had my final dinner on the terrace, watching the sun set over the Mediterranean one last time. Tomorrow would bring disembarkation and the return to regular life. But I was no longer the same person who would be returning. I had discovered something precious during this week at sea. The difference between being alone and being lonely, between being useful and being valued, between accepting what is offered and creating what is desired. As I sipped my final glass of wine and watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky, I realized that this cruise had been less about the destinations we had visited, and more about the journey back to myself. Tomorrow, I would pack my elegant clothes and my new confidence and return to the same house, the same neighborhood, the same family. But I would be carrying with me the knowledge that I was interesting enough to warrant private tours, worthy of luxury experiences, and capable of creating joy for myself without anyone's permission or approval. And that knowledge would change everything. The morning of disembarkation brought that particular combination of excitement and melancholy that marks the end of transformative experiences. I woke early, not from anxiety but from the desire to savor every remaining moment of this version of myself I had discovered over the past week. James appeared with my final breakfast and a small wrapped gift from the crew. "Mrs. Williams, it has been an honor serving someone who so thoroughly enjoyed every aspect of the experience." Inside the elegant wrapping was a leather-bound journal with Eleanor's Mediterranean adventures embossed in gold on the cover, along with a note signed by Chef Laurent, Isabella, and several other crew members I had encountered during the week. "For continuing the journey," the note read, "you have reminded us why we love creating beautiful experiences for people who truly appreciate them." I found myself tearing up, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization of how starved I had been for this kind of recognition and appreciation. The disembarkation process for sweet guests was, naturally, completely different from what I had experienced on previous family cruises. No long lines, no confusion about luggage collection, no stressed announcements over the intercom about keeping families together. James personally escorted me through the priority departure process, ensuring my luggage was handled smoothly and my transportation to the airport was confirmed. Even leaving the ship felt elegant rather than chaotic. As I walked down the gangway for the final time, I spotted Michael's family in the general departure area. They were clustered around several large suitcases, doing the familiar vacation-ending dance of checking and rechecking that nothing had been forgotten while managing tired children and coordinating multiple phone calls about transportation. Sandra was simultaneously trying to keep Jake from running off while Emma attempted to organize everyone's carry-on bags. Karen's teenagers looked like they were ready to be anywhere else, and Michael was clearly feeling the pressure of logistics management. I paused for a moment, watching this scene that had been my reality for so many family trips. The constant negotiation, the stress disguised as organization, the way individual needs got subsumed into group management. Then I continued walking toward my private car, my single elegant suitcase rolling smoothly behind me. At the car, Michael broke away from the family chaos and jogged over to me. "Mom, wait." I wanted to. He paused, breathing hard. I wanted to say thank you. For what? For showing me that there was another way to do this. Another way to be. I hugged him goodbye. A real hug this time. Not hurried or distracted. "Take care of yourself, Michael, and remember what we talked about." "I will, and Mom, next time you plan a trip like this, would you consider letting us know? Not so we can change your plans, but so we can celebrate them." I smiled. I would like that. The ride to the airport was peaceful, giving me time to process everything that had changed over the past week. I wasn't returning home as the same person who had left. I was returning as someone who had remembered her own worth, her own interests, her own capacity for joy. On the plane, I opened the journal the crew had given me and began writing about the experience while it was still fresh. Not just the places I had seen and the luxury I had enjoyed, but the internal shift that had made everything else possible. Day 1, remembered that my comfort matters as much as anyone else's. Day 2, discovered that I am interesting enough to warrant a private guide's full attention. Day 3, learned that I don't have to earn the right to beautiful experiences. Day 4, realized that being alone and being lonely are completely different things. Day 5, understood that love without respect isn't actually love. By the time the plane landed, I had filled several pages with insights that felt worth preserving, not just for myself, but potentially for other women who might need permission to prioritize their own happiness. My house looked exactly the same when I arrived home, but I felt like a stranger viewing it with new eyes. The routines I had left behind, the careful budgeting, the modest expectations, the reflexive deferral to others' preferences, seemed to belong to someone else. That evening, I called Margaret, the woman I would met in the ship's library. We had exchanged contact information and promised to stay in touch. "How does it feel to be back?" she asked. Like I am living in the same house but with completely different furniture in my head, I said. Are you going to keep traveling? Absolutely. I am already looking at river cruises for Christmas markets, and there is a small ship expedition to Norway that looks incredible. Good for you. Don't let anyone talk you out of it. The next evening, Michael called to check in. How are you settling back in? I am good, different, but good. How is everyone recovering from the trip? Honestly, I think we all learned some things. Sandra and I have been talking about how we handle family dynamics, how we make assumptions about what people want instead of actually asking them. That is a good conversation to have. Mom, I have a question. Would you be interested in having dinner next weekend? Just you and me? No agenda? No favors to ask? Just spending time together. I felt something warm and hopeful bloom in my chest. I would love that. Great. And Mom, would you pick the restaurant? Somewhere you actually want to go? After we hung up, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and the Mediterranean travel books I would brought home, planning my next adventure while feeling grateful for the one I had just completed. The cruise had given me more than beautiful memories and luxury experiences. It had given me back myself, the Eleanor who deserved wonderful things, who was interesting enough to warrant private tours, who could create her own joy without anyone's permission or approval. And now that I had found her again, I had no intention of letting her disappear. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Have you ever been told you had slow everyone down? Share this story if you believe that age is no excuse for accepting less than you deserve. Sometimes the most radical thing we can do is simply refuse to make ourselves smaller for other people's convenience.